I was labeling seed packets I had no garden left big enough to plant, an old habit from 40 years of breeding roses, when my son called to tell me I wouldn't be needed at the Horticultural Society's honorary ceremony, recognizing the rose variety my husband and I had spent a decade developing together. I remember setting the marker down slowly, the label still half written, right before his explanation rearranged the entire shape of that phone call. I had no idea that within the same conversation I would also learn that my daughter-in-law's press materials described the rose as a rare variety she'd personally discovered and cultivated, with no mention of the two people who'd actually bred it, and that within the following week I would send a single formal letter through my attorney, terminating a licensing agreement I had signed 2 years earlier, one that would pull her exclusive rights to that rose permanently. My name is Constance Fairweather. I'm 74 years old. I spent over 4 decades breeding roses as a serious amateur, the kind of hobby that teaches you patience most people never develop, and teaches you, too, that a rare variety separated from the hands that actually created it eventually just becomes a story about someone else's lucky discovery. My husband Rupert died 4 years ago, a sudden cardiac arrest while grafting cuttings in our own greenhouse, the kind of quiet, ordinary Saturday morning that gave no warning at all. I remember finding him there, the grafting knife still resting in his open palm, a half-finished cutting still clamped in place. Grief that arrives in the middle of an act of patient devotion teaches you something particular. It teaches you that the smell of turned soil and green growth can undo you completely for years afterward, and that you learn, slowly, to keep walking into that greenhouse anyway, because the alternative is letting the silence claim every bloom you ever touch again. Rupert and I built our life together slowly, the unglamorous way most honest things get built. He worked as a pharmacist for nearly 40 years, precise and methodical with every measurement. The kind of man who read a plant catalog with the same careful attention he brought to a prescription label, a habit that used to amuse me until I understood it was simply how he approached anything he cared about deeply. When I told him 5 years into our marriage that I wanted to pursue serious rose breeding rather than keep it as an occasional weekend hobby, he didn't tell me it would be difficult with 2 small children at home. He told me he'd handle every school pickup and every late dinner on my longest greenhouse evenings, and he did for years, without complaint, never once asking me to choose between the family we were raising and the patience I was slowly building among the roses. I built my own knowledge slowly after that, the way most honest expertise gets built, one carefully documented cross at a time, over 4 decades among the roses, until I finally slowed down considerably with more patience than I sometimes believed I had any right to feel. I remember one particular young gardener, early in my own years with the Regional Society, a woman convinced she'd never develop a proper eye for selecting the strongest seedlings, whom I spent an entire season quietly mentoring after our own shared greenhouse hours, never once mentioning to the Society's board how much extra time it actually required. She went on to a modestly successful breeding hobby of her own, and years later, a letter arrived thanking me for refusing to let her give up on her own instincts. I think about that letter often now, in a different light than I once did, understanding that quiet, uncredited mentorship had always been the actual substance of my working life, long before anyone in my own family learned to take it for granted. Rupert didn't live to see the rose reach its current commercial success. He died 4 years before Anders ever brought Marnie's plans for a signature floral brand to me, and some mornings I still catch myself wanting to show him a particularly promising bloom before remembering there's no one on the other end of that particular conversation anymore. I have 2 children. Bram, my son, is a civil engineer, 3 time zones away, precise and methodical in exactly the way you'd hope an engineer's mind would be. He calls every Sunday evening without fail, a habit that started the year Rupert died and never once lapsed since. Anders, my son, is 40, handles marketing for a regional garden supply chain, married for 4 years to a floral designer named Marnie Calder, 33, whose growing wedding industry reputation he has supported personally since they met, and who has always had a particular gift for making an inherited discovery sound like her own rare find. Marnie grew up in a family that moved through a series of small business ventures, the kind of household where every new opportunity was described as something she alone had uncovered, rather than something built patiently by people who came before her. I don't say that to excuse what eventually happened. I say it because understanding where someone's hunger for soul discovery comes from doesn't mean you're obligated to keep feeding that hunger forever, especially once feeding it starts costing you your own husband's memory. She told me a story once, early in her relationship with Anders, back when we still spoke easily and often, about her own father's habit of describing every inherited or borrowed idea as something he'd personally uncovered through his own sharp instincts. My dad always said finding something impressive mattered more than building it slowly, she told me. I grew up believing that discovery was the more valuable skill and that patient inherited work somehow counted less. I remember thinking at the time that it was a sad philosophy, worthy of real compassion. I didn't yet understand that she had built an entire professional identity around controlling every narrative she touched, and that I would eventually become the inconvenient living history that particular control required minimizing. Rupert and I spent nearly a decade developing our rose together, starting with a single, stubborn seedling that survived a harsh winter nobody expected it to, patiently selecting and cross-pollinating generation after generation until we finally achieved a stable, true breeding variety with the specific soft coral color and heavy, old-fashioned fragrance we'd been chasing the entire time. We registered it formally with the American Rose Society and named it Rupert's Dawn, after the exact shade it turned in early morning light. It found modest, steady success over the years, sold through a handful of specialty nurseries, occasionally requested by discerning florists for its unusual color and scent, enough to bring in a small supplemental income without ever making either of us famous. After Rupert died, that rose became something closer to sacred to me, the clearest remaining trace of a decade of patient work we'd done together, since we'd made every single breeding decision as partners. When Anders came to me 2 years ago, describing Marnie's plans to build a boutique wedding floral business around Rupert's Dawn as her signature flower, I was genuinely moved, thrilled to think of Rupert's careful decade of patient grafting finally reaching brides and florists across the region. I did insist, however, on a proper licensing agreement, drafted formally with my attorney rather than simply handed over on a handshake between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. Marnie would receive exclusive commercial propagation and marketing rights to the variety, along with a standard royalty on every stem sold, in exchange for accurately crediting the rose's actual origin and Rupert's founding role in all promotional materials and public statements. At the time, that condition felt like nothing more than sensible protection for a decade of patient work. It would take 2 years of careful, creeping erasure before I understood exactly what that condition was actually protecting. Before signing anything, I met with my attorney, a sharp, longtime family friend named Odessa Marsh, who had helped Rupert and me handle the original plant patent filing years earlier. Licensing a rare variety you bred yourself is trickier than people assume, she told me. The rose's story has real market value independent of the flower itself, and that value depends entirely on the narrative people believe about where it actually came from. Protect the story as carefully as you protect the patent. I thanked her and left her office determined to follow that advice completely. Marnie signed the agreement herself at Odessa's small conference table, reading every page carefully before asking, almost shyly, if she could walk through the entire greenhouse one more time before committing to anything. I spent that entire afternoon with her, among decades of catalogued varieties, showing her exactly which bed Rupert had started the original seedling in, watching her genuinely absorb the scope of what she was about to represent. I want you to actually understand what this protects, I told her. Not just the flower, the whole story behind it. She promised she understood completely, and I believed her, having no reason at the time to imagine that promise wouldn't eventually be tested by her own growing business ambitions. I remember Marnie's very first bridal showcase using the rose vividly, standing near the display watching longtime clients and fellow florists genuinely moved by the fragrance filling the entire room, several of them asking me directly how such an unusual bloom had come to exist at all. Marnie's floral business launched 2 years ago to genuine early success, Rupert's Dawn serving as her signature flower in nearly every wedding she designed. For the first few months, everything felt like exactly what I'd hoped it would be, the rose's actual name and origin properly credited on her own website, Marnie speaking warmly in early interviews about the honor of working with such a genuinely rare variety. The first time I noticed the story beginning to shift was during a regional bridal magazine profile 8 months in, a glossy piece with professional photography of her latest bridal collection. When Marnie described discovering the rose while sourcing unusual varieties for a client, framing it as a rare find she'd personally tracked down through months of dedicated searching, without ever mentioning that she had simply asked her own mother-in-law directly whether the family rose might be available commercially. I read that article twice at my own kitchen table, searching for even a passing acknowledgement of Rupert's decade of patient grafting, and found none. The second incident happened at a small industry mixer when a genuinely curious florist, meeting me for the first time, complimented the rose's unusual fragrance, asking how Marnie had managed to source such a rare heirloom variety. I corrected the record gently, mentioning that the rose had actually been bred by my husband and me over nearly a decade, unchanged in the underlying genetics since we registered it. Marnie laughed it off smoothly, telling the florist that I was being modest, that she truly had put in the work tracking down and securing this particular rose, and the conversation moved on before I could clarify further. The third incident happened on Marnie's own social media account, a beautifully produced video of her arranging a bridal bouquet, the caption describing her journey, discovering an impossibly rare, nearly forgotten rose variety, and building her entire signature brand around it. My name and Rupert's appeared nowhere in that caption, nor did any mention of the rose's actual decade-long development. The post received thousands of admiring comments about Marnie's discerning eye for rare blooms. I read those comments more than once, searching for even a passing acknowledgement, and found none. The fourth incident happened when Marnie began describing the rose, in interviews for major bridal publications, as a variety she had personally cultivated and stabilized through careful selective propagation, as though the actual decade of cross-pollination and selection had been her own work rather than a decade of patient breeding decisions Rupert and I had made long before she ever entered the family. I mentioned to Anders gently that I found the growing distance from the rose's actual origin increasingly uncomfortable. He told me Marnie simply had a flair for describing her creative process, and that surely it didn't really matter exactly how she framed a detail that small. The fifth incident happened during a planning conversation for the Horticultural Society's upcoming honorary ceremony recognizing regional rose breeders, sitting around Anders and Marnie's kitchen table with a nomination form spread between us. When Marnie mentioned, almost as an aside, that she thought it might be cleaner for the ceremony's own narrative if the framing focused entirely on her own discovery journey with the rose, rather than getting into the licensing agreement specifics, since the society responded better to a clean personal story. "Constance, you understand, right?" she said, glancing at me with a practiced, reasonable smile. "It's not about hiding anything. It's just easier at this point." I sat there listening to my daughter-in-law discuss minimizing my documented breeding rights as a matter of ceremony strategy, as though a decade of Rupert's and my own patient work were an inconvenient footnote rather than the very reason any of this rose existed at all. The sixth incident happened when Marnie's own mother, meeting me for the first time at a holiday gathering, mentioned how proud she was watching her daughter build something so impressive entirely through her own eye for rare and beautiful things. "She's always had that gift," she said, beaming, "for finding overlooked treasures nobody else noticed." I said nothing to correct her, the same way I'd said nothing to correct anyone else. though I remember driving home afterward feeling the particular loneliness of being the only person in an entire extended family who actually knew the truth of a story everyone else believed completely. The seventh incident is the one I think about most, because it's the one where I should have said something and didn't. It happened when Mani's business was featured at a significant regional wedding industry showcase, and the showcase's own promotional materials described Rupert's Dawn entirely as a rare variety Mani had sourced through her own extensive industry connections, with no mention of the rose's actual origin at all. I saw the printed showcase program weeks later, my husband's entire decade of patient work reduced to a single generic phrase, an impossibly rare bloom sourced by a discerning young florist. The eighth incident happened at a small regional floral design award ceremony where Marnie's business was nominated for an innovation award specifically citing her use of Rupert's Dawn. She accepted the smaller recognition award that evening, giving brief remarks about the incredible journey of tracking down a nearly extinct variety nobody else had properly appreciated, gesturing at projected images of the rose as though the years of patient grafting behind it had simply been a lucky accident she'd stumbled into. I applauded along with everyone else, understanding, with a clarity that had been building for 2 years by that point, exactly how completely the record had been rewritten, and exactly how comfortable everyone around me had become with that rewritten version. I didn't understand yet that splinters left alone don't disappear. They work their way deeper. I want to tell you that I confronted this early, that I was the kind of woman who draws a firm line the moment she's disrespected. I wasn't. I told myself 100 different stories to avoid dealing with the truth. Marnie is just building her own brand the way professionals do. Anders loves me even if he doesn't correct her in the moment. The rose is finally reaching people the way Rupert always hoped it would, and that should be enough. I believed every one of those stories, some days more than others, because believing them was easier than accepting that my husband's decade of patient grafting had become an inconvenient detail in someone else's more compelling discovery story. There was one evening, about 2 months before everything finally came to a head, when I came close to saying something. Marnie called to ask whether I'd be comfortable if a magazine profile simply described the rose as a family heirloom variety without getting into specifics about who actually bred it, since she felt the vaguer phrasing made for a cleaner narrative arc in the piece. I sat with the phone in my hand afterward, feeling something rise up in me that felt very close to the surface, very close to finally saying out loud everything I'd swallowed for 2 years. Then I thought about Anders's happiness, about how much this business had already come to mean to him, about how a fight over credit would only ever complicate something he loved. I agreed to the vague phrasing and told myself one more time that the moment to say something hadn't quite arrived yet. Looking back, I understand now that I was wrong about that. The moment had arrived long before. I simply hadn't been ready to stand inside it yet. Then came the call about the honorary ceremony. Anders called on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, his voice carrying a practiced carefulness I recognized immediately, the tone he used whenever he was delivering a message that wasn't entirely his own idea. "Mom," he said, "I wanted to give you a heads up about the Horticultural Society's ceremony next month. Marnie and I think it might be simpler if it's just her accepting the recognition on the rose's behalf. It's a huge platform for her business, and we want the moment to feel focused." I set down the marker slowly, still resting against the half-labeled packet. "Anders," I said carefully, "your father and I spent 10 years developing that rose before Marnie ever heard its name. What exactly does focused mean in this context? It's not about excluding you," he said. "We just want her recognition to feel uncomplicated for this particular ceremony." "I see," I said. "And has the Society's own program even mentioned your father's name, or the rose's actual origin at all? Or is that also part of what needs to feel uncomplicated?" There was a brief pause. "It's mostly focused on Marnie's contribution to the industry right now. We can address the history stuff separately if it comes up." "And you don't think 10 years of your father's own breeding work is relevant information for a ceremony honoring exactly this kind of variety?" He didn't have a ready answer for that. I didn't argue with him further in that moment. I told him I understood, thanked him for the heads up, and hung up the phone. I sat at my own kitchen table for a long time afterward, understanding with a clarity that arrived all at once exactly what I was going to do, though I decided to wait to see how the industry gala 3 nights later unfolded before making any final decision. The gala was held at a converted event barn downtown, string lights woven through exposed beams, 40 guests, including fellow florists, industry journalists, and several society officials who'd come specifically to preview Marnie's newest bridal collection ahead of the honorary decision. I arrived early, helping arrange the reception table out of habit as much as love, the same instinct I'd brought to nearly every one of our own greenhouse open houses over the decades. For the first hour, the evening was in fact lovely. I spoke with several florists who remembered Rupert's Dawn from earlier specialty catalogs, genuinely curious about the variety's history, and with one of the society officials, a careful woman named Priscilla Vance, who asked almost as an aside how the rose had actually come to Marnie's attention. I answered honestly, mentioning the direct family connection in plain, factual terms, and watched Marnie's attention flicker toward us from across the barn without quite approaching. For a little while, I let myself believe the whole evening might simply pass without incident. Marnie gave a toast thanking the florists, the journalists, and her own discerning eye for rare beauty, describing Rupert's Dawn as the rose she'd discovered and built her entire signature brand around, one impossibly lucky find that had changed the entire direction of her career. She gestured warmly at the floral arrangements throughout, never once mentioning the rose's actual origin, its decade-long development, or the man whose patient grafting had made any of tonight's success possible at all. The guests applauded warmly. I stood near the reception table, holding a glass of wine, listening to my husband's entire life's work reduced to a footnote in someone else's discovery story. I stepped forward slowly from where I'd been standing. The barn quieted the way a room quiets when it senses something is about to happen that it hasn't fully decided how to feel about yet. I lifted my own glass, still full. "Since we're toasting a discovery tonight," I said, my voice calmer than I expected it to be, "I'd like to add something to that story since it seems to have gone missing somewhere along the way. This rose was bred over 10 years by my husband Rupert and me, starting with a single seedling that survived a winter nobody expected it to, long before either of us imagined it would end up credited entirely to someone else's lucky find." I paused, letting that land fully before continuing. "To this rose," I said, "that's about to go back to being represented by the actual people who bred it." The silence that followed was the kind you could have poured into a glass and served alongside the wine. Anders's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion first, then something closer to dawning understanding. Marnie's smile didn't fall so much as it simply stopped existing, replaced by something rigid and pale. "Constance," she said quietly, "what are you talking about?" Near the reception table, I saw Priscilla Vance quietly set down her glass, her expression carrying the particular stillness of someone doing rapid calculations about an honorary decision she was reconsidering in real time. I didn't answer the confused murmurs that followed. I set my glass down gently on the reception table, walked to Anders first, kissed his cheek, told him I loved him and that nothing about tonight changed that, and then I picked up my coat and walked toward the door, past the string lights, past the very roses I'd spent a decade helping create, past 40 faces that had gone very quiet, very fast. I drove home with the windows down, the cool evening air moving through the car, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not rage, something quieter and colder than that. Clarity. Somewhere along that dark road, I thought about every early morning Rupert and I had spent together in that greenhouse, decades before either of us imagined our own patient work would end up credited as someone else's lucky discovery. I thought, too, about the years after Rupert died, learning to manage every part of the greenhouse alone, the grafting, the pest management, the small administrative details he'd always handled without complaint. Widowhood had taught me, whether I wanted the lesson or not, that I was considerably more capable than I'd ever given myself credit for while someone else stood beside me. I felt that old, hard-won capability rising back up in me now, and I understood with total clarity exactly what I was going to do before I even reached my own driveway. I called my old friend Harriet before I called anyone else, a woman I'd shown alongside for 2 decades in the same regional rose society, needing to hear a voice that understood the craft as deeply as I did. I told her the whole story, 2 years of incidents, the toast, the walk out the door. She listened without interrupting, her own tea going cold in front of her. "Constance," she finally said, "you taught every young breeder who ever entered a show alongside you that a variety carries a responsibility to honor the hands that actually developed it. I don't think that principle stops applying just because the florist in question happens to be family. I keep waiting to feel guilty about what I'm about to do," I told her, "and it isn't coming." "Maybe it isn't coming," Harriet said, "because there's nothing here to feel guilty about. You didn't abandon your family. You stopped subsidizing your own erasure from it. Those are very different things, no matter how anyone else wants to frame it." I called Bram that same evening as well, needing to hear a voice that would tell me the truth rather than simply agree with me. I told him the whole story, 2 years of incidents leading up to it, the toast, my own response. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Mom," he finally said, "you've been letting yourself get smaller for 2 years so Marnie can feel bigger about a rose she didn't breed. That's not generosity anymore. That's just a slow kind of disappearing." "I know," I said. "I think I've known it for a while. So what happens next? Are you actually going to revoke the license, or is this still just something you're considering?" "I already know exactly what I'm going to do," I told him. "I just needed to talk it through with someone first." That same evening, I called my attorney, Odessa Marsh, who had drafted the original licensing agreement and understood exactly what protection I'd built into it 2 years earlier. I explained the pattern plainly: 2 years of quiet erasure, the toast, the deliberate exclusion from the ceremony. "Let me pull up the actual document while we talk, Constance," she said. "The termination language is specific here: repeated public misrepresentation of the variety's origin and breeding credit, sufficient grounds to terminate with the standard notice period. That condition has clearly been met tonight in front of 40 witnesses, which makes this about as clean a termination case as I've seen in years of drafting these agreements." I sat with that fact for a long moment, understanding finally exactly why I'd insisted on that condition in the first place. Those first few days after the party were harder than I expected. I found myself more than once reaching for the phone to call Odessa and tell her to hold off, that surely there was some gentler way to make my point without actually revoking Marnie's rights. I stood in the greenhouse one entire evening, walking the length of the rows all the way to the original Rupert's Dawn plant itself, still thriving in its original bed, trying to remind myself exactly what I was protecting before I let the decision go any further. Each time, I made myself sit with the discomfort a little longer instead of acting on it, remembering Harriet's words, remembering the actual weight of the phrase "a rose I discovered," remembering that gentler corrections had already had 2 years to work and hadn't. I want to be clear about what I did and did not do because I think it matters. I did not simply demand full control back out of spite. Odessa drafted a formal professional letter terminating the licensing agreement, citing the specific documented misrepresentations by date, the bridal magazine profile, the industry mixer, the social media caption, the showcase program, each one referenced plainly and specifying the standard 60-day window for Marnie to transition away from exclusive use of the variety. I sent that letter through her office with no personal note attached beyond what the letter itself required, the same plain, unremarkable language that could have applied to any licensing dispute between any two parties anywhere in the industry. Anders called the following morning, his voice tight with panic rather than his usual warmth. "Mom, this could sink her entire signature brand. We don't have 60 days to rework her whole business identity." "I understand that's difficult," I said calmly. But Marnie built an entire brand around a rose your father and I spent 10 years developing, then spent 2 years watching that history get quietly rewritten as her own lucky discovery, right up until I learned I wasn't even welcome at the ceremony honoring my own husband's life's work. I'm simply asking for that rose to only be credited the way it was actually bred. There has to be another way to handle this that doesn't threaten her entire brand. There is, I said, several in fact. She keeps using the rose and the credit finally gets told accurately, starting immediately. Or she builds her signature style around a different variety entirely, which she's welcome to do. I'm not interested in destroying what she's built. I'm interested in finally being an honest part of how that story gets told. Marnie called 2 days later, her voice sharp. Constance, this is completely disproportionate. You're punishing me over how I frame press materials. No, I said quietly. I'm the woman who watched you spend 2 years quietly erasing where an entire rose came from, right up until you turned my husband's life's work into a footnote at a gala organized specifically to showcase your own discovery story. I think the real question is what you thought would happen once I finally understood exactly how thoroughly that history was being erased. Every florist wants a clean discovery story. That's not a crime. It isn't, I agreed. But that rose was never meant to fund a clean story in general. It was meant to carry a specific, real one. Those are different things, Marnie, and I think some part of you has always understood the difference, which is exactly why you kept softening the details every time someone asked. She hung up on me. I sat with the dial tone for a long moment, then went back to the greenhouse, understanding that whatever came next would take time to settle. The weeks that followed were difficult ones. Anders called nearly every day at first, caught between his wife's fury and a growing understanding of exactly what had actually been erased. Priscilla Vance, the society official who had attended the gala, called Marnie directly to ask whether the toast she'd witnessed had actually been about her own mother-in-law, since word had traveled through the small regional floral community about a licensing dispute. Marnie told me later that admitting the full truth to Priscilla out loud, for the first time outside our immediate family, had been strangely clarifying. Priscilla just said, I noticed Constance seemed quiet all night at that gala. Now I understand why, Marnie told me. I think I'd spent so long not letting myself notice it either that hearing someone else name it finally made it real. Bram, once he heard the whole story, offered to sit down with Anders directly, walking him through the full timeline the way only a sibling who'd grown up watching our parents work together could. He told me later that he'd laid out the whole sequence for Anders at his own kitchen table, using the same methodical precision he brought to reviewing a structural report, every incident dated and specific, watching his brother's face change as the pattern finally became undeniable. I don't think he understood how systematic it actually was until he saw it laid out chronologically, Bram told me. He kept saying, I thought that was just one weird comment at one dinner. It wasn't one comment, Bram. It was 2 years of them. About a week after the letter went out, Anders asked if I'd be willing to join a video call with him and Marnie together, something he described a little awkwardly as trying to get everyone on the same page. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity about what that page might actually contain. When the call connected, Anders was sitting at their kitchen island, Marnie beside him, her expression carefully arranged into something between contrition and defensiveness. Mom, Anders began, we wanted to talk through everything as a family, figure out what happens next. I'm listening, I said. Marnie spoke first, her voice tighter than I'd heard it before. I think we all said things in the heat of the moment. I know the toast landed wrong, but sending a legal letter with no warning beyond what was legally required felt like it was designed to hurt my business as much as possible. Was that the intention? I considered the question honestly before answering. The intention was to stop watching your father-in-law's actual legacy disappear a little more every month. If it hurt, I understand that. It should. 2 years of quiet erasure doesn't undo itself painlessly just because the reason it's ending is a fair one. I could lose my entire signature brand if this becomes public before I'm ready, Marnie said, her composure cracking slightly. Is that really what you wanted? What I wanted, I said, was to stop being described as a lucky find while your actual business funded itself entirely on 10 years of your father-in-law's patient breeding. I never once asked you to build a brand you couldn't tell, honestly. I only asked, eventually, and apparently not clearly enough, to be treated as an honest part of it. Anders was quiet for a long moment, and then he turned slightly toward Marnie, away from the camera, in a way that suggested he'd forgotten, briefly, that I could still see them both. "She's right," he said to her, quietly but clearly enough for me to hear. "We built an entire narrative around something that wasn't ours to simplify, and I let it happen because correcting it kept feeling like more trouble than it was worth." Marnie's eyes filled, and for the first time in the entire call, she didn't have a rebuttal ready. "I don't know how to fix a story that was built partly on someone else's silence," she said, almost to herself. "You start by no longer needing it to be a story at all," I told her. "Just an accurate description, plain as any patent registration in that Variety's own paperwork." "I'd like that," Anders said. "I've been waiting 2 years to hear it said plainly." The call ended a few minutes later, quieter than it began. About 3 weeks after the letter, Anders came to see me alone, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table. "Bram told me everything," he said, "the whole timeline laid out chronologically. I don't think I understood how systematic the erasure actually was until I saw it that way. I think I let myself believe it was harmless because correcting Marnie kept feeling like more effort than it was worth." "Thank you for saying that now," I told him. "Why didn't you say something sooner, before it went on for 2 years?" "Because I kept telling myself it wasn't about credit," I said. "It was never about credit, Anders. It was about accuracy. About whether your father's actual patient work survived being used or quietly disappeared the moment it stopped being convenient to mention. Can I ask you something? Why did you let it go on for so long? You corrected people yourself early on. Why not every time after that?" "Because I kept believing the next occasion would finally be the one where the truth simply won out on its own," I admitted. "And because, if I'm honest, some part of me was afraid that correcting it too often would make me seem like a difficult mother-in-law rather than a supportive one. It took watching that fear cost me your father's entire legacy to understand how backward that priority actually was." Marnie came to see me on her own several weeks later, considerably more subdued than our phone call had been, sitting stiffly across from me at my own kitchen table. "I keep thinking about how close I came to actually losing my entire brand," she admitted, before we'd even gotten to the harder parts of the conversation. "I know I have complicated feelings about how this happened, Constance, but some part of this fear was just about genuinely almost losing something I'd worked toward for years. That's allowed to be true at the same time as everything else, right?" "Of course it is," I told her gently. "I never wanted you to lose what you'd built. I only ever wanted my own family's part in building it acknowledged honestly." She nodded, wiping her eyes, and continued. "I've been thinking about everything," she admitted, "about how easily the story became mine to control, instead of something I was simply lucky enough to help continue. I think I was scared, honestly, that a rose with a history that impressive would somehow make my own eye for beauty look smaller by comparison, like I hadn't earned any of it myself." "You were never meant to compete with it, Marnie," I told her. "You were meant to help carry it forward, honestly. Those are very different things." "I don't know how to undo 2 years of telling it wrong," she said. "You don't undo it," I told her. "You start telling it accurately, starting now, every single time it comes up, and let the story going forward finally be honest." "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Why did you keep giving me the benefit of the doubt for so long, even after that first magazine article, even after your own correction got laughed off at that mixer?" "Because I wanted so badly for you to be exactly who I hoped you were," I admitted. "It's a very particular kind of hope, watching your son fall in love with someone, hoping she'll turn out to be everything he sees in her. I think I let that hope talk me out of trusting my own instincts for longer than I should have." We talked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon about Rupert, about the greenhouse, about what this rose had actually been bred to carry. I showed her Rupert's original breeding logs for the first time, a decade of careful handwritten notes about cross-pollination attempts, failures, and the eventual success, including 3 full pages documenting the harsh winter that nearly killed the original seedling before it ever bloomed. Marnie read through them slowly, her hands careful, before asking if she could have copies made for her own studio archive, properly labeled this time. By the end of that conversation, something between us had shifted, not fully repaired, but genuinely, honestly begun. Anders and Marnie saw a counselor together that autumn, at Marnie's own insistence, something that had never happened in 4 years of marriage before that year. Marnie told me later that the counselor had asked them, in an early session, to describe the single biggest unspoken assumption underlying their partnership in the business. We both said the rose almost at the same time, Marnie said. Neither of us had ever said out loud how much of what we called my signature brand actually depended on a decade of breeding work that wasn't mine to claim as personal discovery. I called Odessa a few weeks after the letter went out to update her on how everything had actually unfolded, since the family reconciliation had moved faster than either of us expected. Constance, I've drafted a lot of these licensing agreements over the years, she said, and I can tell you what you did wasn't reckless. It was actually one of the more disciplined uses of a termination clause I've seen a client execute in 20 years of practice. I told her I hadn't thought of it in those terms, that it had felt in the moment more like an act of pure grief than discipline. Sometimes the two aren't as far apart as people assume, she said. You built that protection because you understood decades ago exactly how easily a variety story can slip away from its rightful breeders. The fact that you eventually needed it doesn't make you any less careful for having built it in the first place. Bram flew in for Thanksgiving that year, the first time in years that both of my children had gathered under one roof at once, my own dining room filled with the smell of a roast and the sound of easy conversation that hadn't existed at any family gathering in longer than I cared to admit. Anders and Marnie drove over with a pie Marnie had made herself. No professional styling, no staged photographs, just a slightly uneven crust. She laughed about setting down on my counter. Over dinner, Bram's wife Odalis asked innocently enough how the whole Rose situation had eventually settled, clearly having heard only fragments of the story second-hand. The table went quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that used to precede something painful in this family, before Marnie simply said, Constance and Rupert bred that Rose over 10 years, and I spent 2 years letting a cleaner discovery story replace that history because the truth felt like it made my own eye for beauty look less impressive somehow. She finally made me prove I could actually earn being part of that story honestly. Nobody laughed uncomfortably. Nobody needed the subject changed. Odalis, genuinely curious rather than unkind, asked Marnie how it had felt, realizing the truth so publicly. Marnie was quiet for a moment before answering honestly. Humbling isn't a strong enough word, she said. I think I finally understood what it costs someone else when you let a good discovery story replace an accurate one. I appreciated that she didn't try to soften the admission for the sake of a pleasant holiday table. A few weeks after that Thanksgiving, a card arrived in my mailbox, Anders's familiar handwriting on the envelope. Inside, he'd written only a few lines. Mom, I keep thinking about all the years I let Marnie's version of our story become the only version anyone heard. I can't undo that, but I can promise to correct the record every time it comes up again, out loud, without waiting for you to have to do it yourself. Thank you for finally showing all of us what that rose actually cost and what it was actually worth. Tucked inside the same envelope was a smaller note in Marnie's own handwriting, brief and considerably more humble than anything she'd ever said to me directly. Constance, I spent 2 years building a brand identity around a rose that was never mine alone to claim discovery of. I'm sorry it took nearly losing my own business for me to understand that. I folded both notes carefully and placed them in a small drawer where I kept a photograph of Rupert standing proudly beside that very first surviving seedling. Decades earlier, both of them considerably younger than either of us had any right to remember clearly anymore. I think he would have recognized exactly what those notes meant, and I think he would have been quietly satisfied that the record eventually corrected itself. Marnie's business materials were corrected within the month. A new section added describing the rose's full history, Rupert's original breeding decisions, my own continued involvement, a decade properly credited in every catalog and wedding portfolio. Marnie requested a new feature with the same regional bridal magazine that had run the original discovery story, this time providing the rose's complete, honest history for their materials. The publication, mildly surprised by a florist actively requesting a more complicated story than the one they'd already printed, agreed to run a corrected profile the following season, one that finally credited a decade of careful breeding work rather than framing the rose as a lucky personal find. Priscilla Vance, notably, reached out to Marnie directly that winter, having heard through the small regional floral community that the rose's history had finally been disclosed honestly, and expressed renewed interest in the honorary ceremony, framing it now as an opportunity to recognize both the rose's founding decade and its continued modern popularity together. I told her I appreciated the honesty this time around, Marnie told me. She said that was actually the whole reason she was willing to reconsider the invitation at all. The rescheduled ceremony that spring finally honored Rupert by name, a small plaque bearing both his and my own names, alongside a pressed specimen of the original bloom, mounted permanently in the Society's own regional garden. 3 months after the letter, once that honest history had genuinely taken root in how the family spoke about it, I reinstated Marnie's exclusive licensing rights under identical terms, requiring nothing further beyond what had always been agreed. Anders hugged me for a long time when I told him. "I promise," he said, "every single interview from now on starts with the real story." I saw Harriet again that spring, over coffee at the same small cafe where we'd talked through everything the week after the gala, the same corner table we'd claimed as our own for years without ever quite deciding to. I told her about the reconciliation, the corrected materials, the honest feature. Harriet listened with the same quiet satisfaction she'd shown from the very beginning. "I told you it would matter, holding that line," she said. "Most people don't have the nerve to actually do it, even when they know they should. You did, and look what it actually bought you. Not just the licensing rights back, the truth back." I thought about that phrase for days afterward, the truth back, understanding that it described exactly what I'd been missing more than any royalty ever could have. "Do you regret any of it?" Harriet asked gently, "the 2 years of silence before you finally acted?" "I regret the silence," I told her. "I don't regret the partnership or the family or even the patience I gave before finally reaching my limit. I think I needed all of it, in some strange way, to finally understand exactly what I was protecting when I insisted on that clause 2 years ago. I think about that phone call about the honorary ceremony often, the half-labeled seed packet still on my kitchen table, my son's careful voice explaining why my presence would complicate a clean story. At the moment, it felt like the end of something. Looking back now, I understand it was actually the beginning of something else entirely, a family finally required to reckon honestly with the legacy it had been quietly editing. I don't regret licensing that rose freely. Anders's happiness mattered to me, and it still does. What I regret is how long I allowed my own husband's decade of patient work to be quietly rewritten before I finally insisted the record reflect reality. Real legacy was never meant to require its own history's erasure as the price of being properly appreciated, and I intend to make sure every story I'm actually part of survives being told accurately from now on. I think, too, about all the years I spent believing that quiet generosity was itself a kind of grace, that a good mother-in-law simply handed over whatever her children needed without ever asking the story to acknowledge the true cost. I no longer believe that. Giving without acknowledgement isn't grace. It's simply a slower, quieter kind of erosion, and it costs exactly as much in the end, whether you name it out loud or not. The difference is only in how long you wait to stop paying for it. I think about the specific moments now with a clarity I didn't have while I was living inside them. The bridal magazine crediting Marnie's discovery. The florist told a story about sourcing that never happened. The showcase program's single generic phrase standing in for a decade of careful breeding. Each one seemed small enough to excuse in isolation. Strung together, they formed something considerably less innocent, a pattern deliberate enough that I no longer believe, looking back, that any of it was entirely accidental. Marnie may not have consciously planned each individual omission, but the cumulative effect served a purpose she understood on some level, even if she never named it to herself, keeping the rose's real history small enough that the story could remain entirely conveniently hers. Real generosity, I've come to believe, doesn't require secrecy to survive, and it certainly doesn't require humiliation as its price of admission. If a family needs you to disappear quietly into the background of your own husband's legacy in order to feel comfortable with their own narrative, that discomfort is telling you something important, and it deserves to be listened to, not smoothed over with another vague toast. I think of it now the way I used to think about a rose left ungrafted too long, its rootstock quietly reasserting itself beneath a bloom that was never truly its own. You can ignore that slow reversion for a while if you want to. It never once corrects itself on its own. It only continues quietly until someone finally looks closely enough to see what's actually growing there. I think sometimes about all those years in the greenhouse with Rupert, learning that every honest breeding decision depends on respecting exactly what a plant actually needs before you ever try to shape it into something else. It took me 74 years and one very public toast at my own daughter-in-law's industry gala to apply that same standard to my own family. I licensed that rose freely, and I would license it freely again, but I no longer accept a version of legacy that erases its own origin. If I am the reason a rare variety exists at all, I intend to remain visibly part of that variety's story, not because I need applause, but because pretending otherwise was never generosity. It was only ever a kindness to someone else's more convenient narrative, purchased at the cost of my own husband's memory. The floral business celebrated its next milestone quietly the following year. Family and close friends only, no press, no society officials, no rehearsed toast designed to impress anyone watching. Simple string lights and vases of Rupert's Dawn, finely arranged exactly the way they always should have been, the fragrance filling the small room the same way it had at that very first showcase 2 years earlier. Marnie gave a short, genuinely humble speech that evening, thanking her staff, thanking Anders for his marketing instincts, and then, without any hesitation or vague qualifier, thanking me and Rupert specifically for a decade of work that made any of tonight's success possible at all. She said our names clearly, our actual contributions stated plainly, no vague phrase standing in for the truth. Bram flew in specially for the occasion, standing near the back of the small crowd with genuine warmth on his face. Harriet attended as my guest, finally getting to see the rose, properly credited the way it was always meant to be understood. I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for 2 years. I am 74 years old, a widow, a retired rose breeder, a mother who still shows up for the people she loves whenever she is needed. But I am no longer a woman who quietly hands over her husband's life's work while watching its true origin get replaced by something more convenient. That particular version of me stayed behind in that beautifully lit barn, along with an untouched glass of wine and a toast about a rose she discovered that nobody in that room will ever quite forget. I drove home that night as one woman, and I woke up the next morning as another, and I have never once wished myself back into the first one. Sometimes people ask me if I'd do anything differently, if given the chance to go back to the day Anders first told me about Marnie's plans, knowing everything I know now. I tell them the truth. I would license that rose again every single time because Anders's happiness was never the mistake. The mistake was assuming a good variety would naturally protect its own history, that a decade of careful breeding decisions could survive on their own weight without anyone occasionally insisting the actual breeders be acknowledged. If I could change one thing, it wouldn't be the license I gave. It would be the 2 years of small corrections I let slide, corrections I mistook again and again for graciousness rather than what they actually were, a slow and quiet surrender of my own husband's memory. Bram's own children ask me sometimes, whenever they visit the greenhouse, to tell them the whole story of how Rupert's Dawn actually came to be. That one stubborn seedling surviving a winter it shouldn't have, a decade of careful cross-pollination, Rupert's own patient handwriting filling logbook after logbook. I tell it every single time exactly the same way, unhurried and complete, watching them absorb a history that finally belongs to everyone who actually helped grow it. No detail softened, no name left out, exactly the way it should have been told from the very beginning. These days, when anyone asks about the rose behind that floral business's success, they hear the whole story: the surviving seedling, the decade of patient grafting, a marriage folded into 10 years of careful work. I'm simply finally exactly as present in that history as I always should have been.